Hello and welcome to the Smithsonian Science for Global Goals Sustainable Communities Guide Overview. You'll notice as you look through the guide that it has 7 parts. You can implement the guide by going through each part from part 1 to part 7 and completing all the tasks. However, we broke them into smaller pieces so that you can also choose what you use based on your context. There are 2 approaches for choosing what you use. One is that the educator can go through the guide ahead of time and choose tasks or parts of the guide to implement based on time or lesson plans that they already have or standards that they must meet in their context. The second approach is by going through all of part 1 with the students, and at the end of part 1, having students choose the rest of the tasks or parts of the guide they would like to use based on the results of their investigation or their interest about their community. During our professional development, we do give time at the end so that educators can have a chance to look at the guide, select which parts they might like to use or might be appropriate for their context, and develop an action plan for implementation. Within each part, you'll notice that there are 5 different tasks. These tasks will start with discover tasks, which give a general overview and connect students to the topic. Then they'll move to tasks that ask students to understand the topic and delve deeper into investigating what that looks like for their community. Finally, the part ends with an action task, asking students to take the results of their investigation and think about what they could do to act on these results and improve their community. Within each task, we continue this discover, understand, act format, going from a general topic and connection to a deep investigation, and finally give them a type of action to do before they move on to the next task. Doing this cycle within each task and then having the larger cycle implemented within each part reinforces student learning. And we hope that you notice that your students get used to this pattern as they go through the guide with you. During our professional development, we go through tasks from parts 1, 2, 3, and 7 of the guide. Let's go over the different parts now. Part 1 asks us, what are sustainable communities and how do they relate to me? This part will ask students to think about their identity and how they connect to sustainable communities. Then we move on to part 2, which asks us about the people in our community and who makes decisions in our community. Part 3 asks us to think about the spaces in our community and particularly shared spaces in the community. Part 4 goes through housing in our communities. Part 5 is about transportation in our communities. And part 6 is about resource consumption in our communities. And resource consumption deals with both the infrastructure that we use for resources and those resources that are disposable. You might think about this in the terms of electricity. We think about electricity as something we use constantly all the time because we have infrastructure for it that could potentially deliver electricity to us 24/7. However, we can also think about electricity as a consumable resource, a disposable resource, because once we use a specific amount of electricity, that energy dissipates and is gone. We can't use that exact same energy in the same way until it goes through the Earth system cycles. Finally, we close with part 7, which asks students to develop an action plan about what they can do to make their community more sustainable or how they can improve their community. Now that you have an overview of each part, and we'll go through each of parts 1, 2, 3, and 7 in our professional development, we have some recommendations for how you implement these in your classroom. As always, we believe that going through all the parts of the guide from part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way through part 7 is going to lead to the most successful implementation of the Smithsonian Science for Global Goals ethos and give your students the most depth. However, we do recognize with limitations in different types of contexts that you may not have time or materials for a full implementation. So we recommend that you at least do parts 1, 2, and 7 of the guide. The reason why we recommend doing parts 1 and 2 is for students to get a full overview and good picture of their community before moving on to different topics, where they will have to use that picture of the community in order to investigate and drill down into specific issues. So parts 1 and 2, we highly recommend you complete before moving on to any of the other parts. Then, after you've done part 1 and 2, you can pick from parts 3, 4, 5, or 6. You can do multiple of these parts, or you can just choose one depending on your context. We go over the shared spaces part in our workshops with you because we believe that shared spaces are something that is easily accessible for an intro to every community. So you might choose those spaces, but the other parts are going to be just as accessible to any community as long as you have time to drill down into them. So you can choose housing, you could just do transportation, you could just do resources, or a combination of any of those middle parts. Finally, we do recommend you close with part 7, no matter whether you've done only one or multiple of parts 3 through 6. 7 is vital to a good implementation of the Sustainable Communities Guide because in part 7, students develop an action plan. And it's this action plan for their community that develops their agency and ability to act for a sustainable world. In order to help you get a handle of what exactly is in the guide and what parts you might like to do, we do have planners that appear at the beginning of the guide. And you can see here, the planners give you different activities in each task. They give you a description of the activities, any materials you would need or technology, any materials from earlier parts in the guide. You'll notice a lot of materials from parts 1 or 2 end up being added on to refer to later in the guide, approximate timing, and the page number of each activity. There is a full planner in the beginning for the whole guide, so you could just look through the planners ahead of time if you want to get a feel without having to go through the whole 200-page guide. But if you are looking at printing things out for your students or looking at only specific parts of the guide right away, we do have a planner for each part in the beginning of each part if you are using it in smaller sections. And you can download the Sustainable Communities Guide in smaller sections online if you do not want to have to look at the whole 200-page PDF. Now it's your turn. Go ahead and type in the following URL to look at the Sustainable Communities Guide. This is the full version. Or you can go to the Smithsonian Science Education Center website and our Global Guides page to look for the Sustainable Communities Guide in parts. After you go to the PDF, think about what topics or activities might interest you or your community or your students, what parts you might be most motivated to look at, and note some of the materials you might need, or how you might want to augment those sections for your particular context or classroom. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.